Hi, my name is Brad, and today I'm bringing you a brand new series where I react and analyse various games based around historical settings and events, and try to deconstruct and maybe offer additional insight to their respective themes. I've been interested in history for basically all my life. I've studied various periods from the ancient Romans, Tudor England, to the topic that's captured my attention the most, the Cold War, in particular the history of the USSR and the Vietnam War. I also graduated from the University of Bristol in Arts and Humanities, where I further honed my interest for history. So hopefully you don't think I'm just spouting nonsense without some form of credential. So because of that, and due to the imminent announcement of the next installment of Black Ops, I thought I'd look back at the first game in the series and see if I can deconstruct the story and the events that take place. Operation 40.
The police are gonna be here soon. Let's make this quick.
Woods, it's been a while.
Well enough, Carlos. You know Bowman, right?
Carlos.
Mason. What's up, Carlos? So you got what we need?
He will be in here. The plantation. My old plantation. Our attack on the airfield should distract them enough to get you inside.
What about the evac?
We will have transport waiting for you. Just be there.
Excellent. You got company.
Saquen los papeles. Ahora. Sal de aquí, puta capitalista. Oye, ¿de dónde tú eres? I said, where are you from?
Just be cool, Woods. Wait.
Talking to you.
All right. Everything is ready.
So Operation 40 is the code name for the CIA's group of Cuban exiles that they would use to launch an invasion into Cuba to try and overthrow the Castro regime. This is originally orchestrated and approved by Eisenhower in 1960, following the Cuban Revolution the previous year. Following the election of JFK in the same year, he authorized an invasion into the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast in 1961, the full invasion date coming on 17th of April 1961. Now, from what we can garner from the previous cutscene, the purpose of us Americans being in Cuba at that time is to use the cover of Bay of Pigs to orchestrate an assassination on Castro. Now, Castro is actually quite notorious for having a number of attempts on his life throughout his reign. I think it's in the number of around nearly 600 attempts on his life overall. Now, following that momentary bit of action there, I find it interesting that this covert American CIA orchestrated group would effectively fight through the streets so brazenly and loudly like this, while simultaneously you would have thought that they would be trying to keep US involvement largely unknown. It seems a little counterintuitive, so I don't know. I mean, obviously it makes for an entertaining sequence, but again, it takes you out a little bit. So we fast forwarded to the point where we're now entering the compound to assassinate Castro.
Get in position. That's it. Ready to make history?
Bitch! He uses a human shield and she still protects him?
Castro supporters and fanatical in devotion.
Well, the target is down.
So you can see there during the assassination, Mason comments on the devotion to their leader after the woman tries to kill them after being used as a human shield. And initially this makes sense. To the Cuban people, Castro has overthrown a dictator, the previous dictator, Fulgencio Batista, and this made him a hero to the people once he established the communist government. And while I think this slowly did erode over time as the government became increasingly authoritarian, initially Castro would have been celebrated and revered, so I can kind of understand why they put that in there, and it's quite interesting to see. Overall, the invasion of the Bay of Pigs was a complete disaster for the US and CIA due to multiple factors. It failed within 2 days, largely due to the factors of Kennedy scaling back the air support for the nasal invasion because he wanted to keep US involvement to a minimum, I think, ultimately. And then there was also incredibly poor planning by the CIA, who underestimated the strength of the Cuban military. So they also gave the invasion force poor training and equipment overall. And then possibly the most crucial bit here is that the element of surprise was mostly lost due to some of the Cuban exiles talking about the invasion and newspapers in Miami running that story. So if you're Cuba/Castro, you wouldn't have to go far finding out about how the US is staging an invasion on your southern coast. Was it largely Kennedy's fault? Well, to be fair, I've seen some people say it was Kennedy's fault, but I also think, to be fair to Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs was orchestrated mostly by Eisenhower and the CIA, who are no strangers to destabilizing foreign powers. In 1953, they orchestrated the Iran coup to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in favor of the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. So while Kennedy did provide the authorization to go ahead with the invasion, he wasn't that thrilled about supporting it. Vorkuta.
Victor Reznov.
My friend.
You hit like a child!
Только через силу, понимаете? Собаки!
Hey, сволочь!
Всегда ты, Резнов!
Reznov.
Mason, every journey begins with a single step.
This is step one! Now, we take Vorkuta! What is step two?
So this mission takes place in the prison camp or gulag of Vorkuta, which was a real detention camp set up by the USSR in 1932. Based up in the Arctic Circle by the Ural Mountains, it was used as a forced labour camp to mine the recently discovered coalfields. There are a couple immediate problems with this mission though. The biggest one is the fact that Vorkuta, or Vorkutalag as it was actually called, was closed a year before this mission takes place, in 1962. This was due to Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization, where he implemented a number of reforms to expose Stalin for what he really was, a mass murderer, borderline traitor to the Soviet Union, which included closing a number of the gulags in operation in Siberia and the Arctic Circle, among countless other things as well. Vorkuta was known as one of the worst gulags, and throughout its operation it's estimated to have killed nearly 200,000 prisoners. So it's up there with some of the worst gulags we know about, including like Kolyma and places like that. In this mission, we see the prisoners rise up and go through a number of stages to secure their freedom from the camp. And while these uprisings weren't that common, they did happen. In fact, multiple took place in Vorkuta itself, which is probably why it was chosen as a location for the story. We have the Lezorid uprising in 1942, where around 100 prisoners and non-prisoners disarmed and overran the logging camp guards and managed to get to a nearby town of Ust-Usa, where they attacked communications offices, the NKVD office and jail, and they freed countless other prisoners in the process. Eventually, the prisoners were slowly beaten back from a number of raids, including one on the airfield of the town, until they were eventually cornered where they took their own lives instead of being captured. The more recent uprising in 1953 lasted around 14 days, from July 19th to August 1st. But instead of the glorious uprising we see in the game, it was far more passive, where inmates of various camp detachments staged a mass walkout with the demands of lower production targets, increased wages, and to be allowed to write more than 2 letters a year. The total number of inmates of the strike reached around 18,000, where they remained within the barbed wire perimeter of the camp. For a week, the camp administration did nothing other than increasing perimeter guards, and that went on until July 26th, when the inmates stormed the maximum security compound and released 77 more of its inmates. Following this, the camp chief started mass arrests, to which inmates responded with barricades. And then finally on August 1st, after an almost bloodless uprising, the camp chief ordered direct fire on the mob. It killed 53 workers and ending the uprising. Now this mission tries to tell a much more bloody but successful version of that uprising, it seems, where we slowly rise up from the mines to overthrow the camp guards, and it's meant to feel like this glorious escape attempt. And while playing this mission, there's also a part of me that knows that they put these camps in Siberia and the Arctic for a reason. It's incredibly hard to survive outside of these camps. At the end of this mission, we see a map where Mason essentially walks or somehow travels to Western Europe from Vorkuta, which is over 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles in the snow while remaining undetected and still being able to get food and water easily. Just seems a little bit insane to me. I mean, granted, I know Mason is a CIA operative, so he should have some training to deal with this, but there's only so much you can really garner from training. Towards the end of the mission as well, we get this sequence where we break into the armory. And for some reason, this gulag up in the Arctic Circle has an American, basically brand new minigun. I mean, this thing was designed in 1960, this model. So it somehow also has its NATO spec ammunition available. I get this segment is quite fun and cathartic, and it makes a great moment in the game for entertainment, but it still perplexed me. And actually, again, during the motorcycle chase, you somehow have these Winchester Model 1887 lever action shotguns, which I thought, again, would be rather difficult to find in the Arctic of the USSR. It's great fun, but totally ridiculous. Executive Order.
No response on Weaver. We gotta move. Stay sharp, Mason. Let's go. Pick it up. Whiskey, come back.
Go, X-Ray.
Soyuz 1 launch is imminent. We're on our way. Over.
Roger.
Running out of time, Mason. Let's go.
This mission takes place at the Baikonur launch site in Kazakhstan, which is where still many of the USSR and modern-day Russia's rocket launches take place. When we think about the Cold War, we of course think about events like the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, and the other proxy wars that occurred around that time. But you could almost equate that to just half of the Cold War, with the other half being about the space race and technological advancements that take place during that period. From October 1957, you have the Sputnik launched as the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, with the USSR following up on this success with the first living thing in space, Laika, a month later. Then in 1961, you have the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, aboard the Vostok 1. In 1963, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. So the US knows it has to ramp up its effort in the space race and shoot for the final objective, the moon. Now Kennedy knows this, and he says it in his 1962 address at Rice University.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Now, in this mission, it seems we have to sabotage the launch of this rocket. However, in the game, Woods calls it a Soyuz rocket launch. Now, the Soyuz missions weren't launched until 1966, while this mission takes place in 1963. It's more likely that the rocket they'd be using here, as far as I know, would be a Vostok, which saw its first use in 1961. It's just a little mishap with the naming of the rockets here, but it's nothing major really. Now, the idea of a US Special Forces team infiltrating and disrupting a Soviet rocket launch during the time, I think would be out of the question. I don't know of any, and I couldn't find any evidence of either US or USSR attempted sabotage of this nature during the space race. I think any attempted sabotage of this nature during the space race, if it was discovered, there would be a crisis of unprecedented scale. Again, I know this mission is kind of there to highlight the importance of the space race, and it is a fun and entertaining segment, but at the same time, you kind of get pulled out of it with just how insane an idea this would be. With the explosion of the rocket, there were many times where a rocket would fail on launch, not just in the USSR, but in the US as well, just due to the level of rapid technological advancements that were taking place during the time. Everyone was trying to one-up each other as quickly as possible, so there were obviously events where accidents can take place, launch failures and things like that. For Baikonur, a famous example of this would be the Netherlands catastrophe. That was in October 1960. A prototype R-16 ICBM was being prepared for testing when an explosion in the rocket's second stage ignited accidentally and just caused a devastating explosion, killing an unknown amount of Soviet personnel. So this mission could be working off of that as an example of what can go wrong with these launches, but I can't say for certain. It's probably how the US would try and cover up an attempt of sabotage like this, rather than a guided missile, for example. S.O.G.
The Psychedelic Music Show at AFVN. I'm Army Specialist Zach Johnson. Our APO here is 96309. If you send a request to that number, what we do is we open it like this. When it arrives, we read it, pull out that record, and play it on the air. Like this one, Fortunate Son.
Now we move forward to 1968, where we're seeing the increasing deployment of US troops to Vietnam. This mission takes place on January 21st in Khe Sanh, a US military base that oversaw Route 9, which General Westmoreland, the overall head of the Vietnam campaign, believed would one day take US troops into Laos to cut off the trail of supplies coming south through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is essentially a path cut out through the Laotian and Cambodian jungles after the US blockaded the sea routes that were being used before. So the North Vietnamese cut this path for trucks and personnel to march south through these neutral countries. I think the North Vietnamese called them the extended battleground or something to that nature. So at this time we see there's a huge attack taking place in Khe Sanh with mortar fire and waves of North Vietnamese troops trying to storm the base. And this did actually happen. This attack was a preliminary assault just before Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. And it was seen as so critical by the US President Lyndon Baines Johnson that he kept a model of the base and the overall battlefield installed in the White House so he could keep up to date hour by hour of events. He equated it as, or he is quoted as saying, "I don't want another damn Dien Bien Phu." And what he's referring to is the French Battle of Dien Bien Phu when they occupied Vietnam after World War II, or they came back to secure their colonial holding after World War II. The Viet Minh at the time, the militia that was set up by Ho Chi Minh, scaled this massive guerrilla campaign to try and overthrow and kick the French out to secure their independence. And one of the most crucial battles during the time of when they're discussing a ceasefire / peace treaty is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So between March 13th and 7th of May 1954, there was a battle in the highlands of North Vietnam that oversaw huge numbers of North Vietnamese or Viet Minh artillery bombarding this position for the French. And by the time that this battle ended, it was a humiliating French defeat. So when Johnson refers to Dien Bien Phu, he doesn't want another humiliating defeat like that, which could potentially just lower their position in the war and cause them to withdraw. Khe Sanh to the North Vietnamese, however, was more of a distraction to build up and possibly draw US and South Vietnamese forces away from key areas in preparation for the Tet Offensive. Now, the Tet Offensive, which we see in one of the following missions, was a countrywide series of attacks by the North Vietnamese troops and Viet Cong guerrillas to try and topple the South Vietnamese government, and that took place during the 1968 Tet ceasefire, hence the name. Hidden detachments of North Vietnamese troops would suddenly spring up in populated cities and provincial capitals to try and dismantle the government of Nguyen Van Thieu through assassinations and heavy fighting in these areas. It's interesting that they've shown the North Vietnamese using tanks during this first wave of assault. As far as I know, they didn't use tanks like this during the attack at Khe Sanh. They had a small number of Soviet tanks provided to them through supply lines in China and the USSR. However, I think the North would have used these more sparingly, and especially not in the first wave assault, knowing the US had air superiority and firepower to take them out quickly. The North Vietnamese actually had a policy to try and combat US air superiority. We kind of see it first at the Battle of Ai Drang in 1965. The Battle of Ai Drang was the first full-scale assault by US troops in Vietnam. It was at the eastern foot of the Chu Pong Massif in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, and essentially we saw firsthand of how US forces acted and North Vietnamese / Viet Cong forces would act to this first scale confrontation of troops. The North Vietnamese essentially came up with the idea of stopping US air power being used so efficiently by coming up with a strategy known as simply grab them by the belt buckle, which meant get as close to the enemy as possible so there are full-on brawls almost. You're almost on top of them to prevent them from calling air support onto their own positions. Now in this moment we see the player fighting down and then back up various hills, and while it's certainly not a massive point in the game, I think it could also be a reference to the numerous battles that took place during the Vietnam campaign over hills such as this. It's a small moment, but it just reminded me as we're fighting up this hill, it reminded me of battles such as Hill 875 or Hill 937, all of them named after their height in meters. And there are also plenty of media that mention these battles as well, films like Hamburger Hill for example. So it's interesting to see that little homage to that almost. And as we reach the top of the hill, we get another reference to the poor quality and frequent jamming of the M16 rifles provided to the US forces. There are countless accounts from veterans that discuss how badly the M16 performed in the terrain that they found themselves in. It jammed often and needed constant maintenance to ensure it didn't fail, but more often than not, it would jam during contact with the enemy. It was a notorious issue that they knew about. I think it did later get fixed down the line, but to equate how many men may have died because of that simple, poor design is indescribable. We couldn't put a number on it. The Defector.
Way City. That's when things really started to unravel for you, Mason.
The Defector.
MACB compound in sight. You are jumping into some deep shit, Woods.
We're here to yank a defector with vital intel on Soviet involvement in Nam. We lost contact with his security team. He may be holed up in the MACB safe room.
These lines, go find him!
Copy, XAG, hook up.
Hold your incendiaries. Where we heading, Mason?
So now it's February 2nd, so we're in the first phase of the Tet Offensive now, and we're in Hue, the old imperial capital of Vietnam. Hue had some of the worst fighting throughout the Tet Offensive, as the city was effectively cut off from the outside. So support from the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese and US forces in the city were completely cut off to the occupied areas inside the city. Alongside that, you had a huge civilian population that couldn't evacuate, so they suffered many casualties due to the large scale of the fighting. We actually see throughout this mission North Vietnamese soldiers firing at civilians. It's estimated that more than 5,000 civilians were killed altogether, and 2,000 of them were executed by the North. After listening to some interviews with North Vietnamese and Viet Cong veterans, many of those who were killed were either civil officials or people who knew who among them were North Vietnamese spies. So in order to conceal their identity, almost entire neighborhoods were wiped out. We can see this from the segment that fighting in the city was heavy and close quarters, literally building by building. There were segments of the city under control by the South, North, and US, all trying to cut each other off, while trying to maintain contact with each other. While in this moment we have the support from the APC and the helicopter, more often than not in Hue, it was hand-to-hand combat. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong wouldn't be pushed out of Hue until 2nd of March, so over a month of fighting took place just to secure the city street by street. And after the Battle of Hue, US patrols actually found mass burial sites when retreating North Vietnamese forces took civilians and executed them in rice paddies to ensure that nobody knew who worked for the North. So what we're seeing in these parts where we can see North Vietnamese shooting at civilians, it's pretty accurate as to how they would do it. The first Black Ops took inspiration from all these events during the early start of the Cold War and placed the players straight in the middle of them. From the Tet Offensive, the space race, to the Bay of Pigs. While it's not always accurate to the real representation, it was a crucial step for me as I became so fascinated by the Cold War because of it. Sure, there are moments that are complete fantasy and not accurate at all, but they're there for entertainment purposes. It got me hooked into the story and the game, which then led me down the path of researching these events, discovering what actually happened. It was the start of my fascination with the Cold War. Black Ops will always occupy a part of my brain that I probably won't forget. I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to see more, please consider clicking the subscribe button and give the video a like. Also, let me know what games you want to see me discuss in the future. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.